Michael says compassion. What in the sermon makes you say compassion, Michael? The care for the lost sheep being one of those examples, shows the compassion that Jesus is admonishing in chapter 18. What other themes in chapter 18? How so, Albert? Delegated authority? The language, I believe that's around verse 17 or so, 18. The delegated authority, which you bind will be bound, and so forth. The ability to make decisions and judgments, so on and so forth. Okay, what else? Other themes? Dangers of being a stumbling block. And Greg, what does it mean to be a stumbling block?
To cause someone to either weaken their faith, fall from the faith, or to keep them from, being part of the faith.
Okay, thank you, Greg. Other themes and examples of those themes from chapter 18. Forgiveness. Jamie, what did he say about forgiveness? Do you remember anything specific? That's what we're supposed to do, she said. How many times, Jamie, should I forgive my brother? 490. Yeah, exactly. Once you get to 490, then you're done. So, forgiveness and doing that, freely is the point. Maybe we'll take one more theme from chapter 18 before we... Yeah, Mike. Concern for salvation. And we'll say over your own interest, Mike says. Okay. I'm having a hard time erasing this board every time. Some of y'all will get here early. You guys are just watching and laughing as I'm trying desperately to erase what's been up here before. So if we keep doing this, then I may move to the chalkboard side of it, get all dusty like a old school math professor, but it might be easier to see than this is. But hopefully you can see that, or at least remember these themes, because we're going to be working with these as we jump into chapter 19. And let's talk about why we'll be doing that. Here's our chart that we're familiar with, hopefully, about the alternating sections of the Gospel of Matthew. And remember that what these do, what Matthew is doing as he weaves these all together, is a couple different things. Sometimes the yellow boxes, the sections of narrative, the stories that Matthew tells, set up the teaching that he is going to present from Jesus. So, for instance, in the very first set, the origin story of Jesus, about him being a king and coming to establish a kingdom. All of that leads into, very naturally, the Sermon on the Mount, in which Jesus talks about the kingdom and what kind of kingdom it is and the righteousness of the kingdom, right? Or, in chapters 8 and 9, the stories of Jesus demonstrate his authority and also his healing purpose. He's performing miracles to show that he is someone who's bringing healing to the world. Well, then in chapter 10, his sermon is sending out the 12, giving them authority as he has, and sending them out to heal and to cast out demons in the way that he has. So sometimes the stories set up the teaching. Sometimes the teaching is a nice segue into the stories that follow. Okay? So, for instance, in chapter 10, that same sermon we were talking about, where he talks to the apostles, the 12, about going out and preaching as he has preached, he tells them, some people are going to accept you, and they're going to feed you, welcome you into their home. Some people are going to reject you, they're going to persecute you, they're going to throw you in jail, so on and so forth. Okay? Well, then that's a nice segue into the stories of chapters 11 and 12, in which there is a constant back and forth in those stories between those that accept Jesus, accept his invitation to come and take my yoke, and those, primarily the Pharisees, that are rejecting Jesus and going to be persecuting him in his ministry as well. Okay, so as we think about chapter 18, which y'all nailed, all four of those that I had, you already gave us in terms of the themes of chapter 18. So Robert, you see that? They came up with this, and that's the right answer. So you know you were effective as a teacher on Sunday. But this sermon in chapter 18 feeds off of the stories that came before. I'll give you one example that's kind of cool. I don't know how much to make of this. The word that's translated church oftentimes in the New Testament, the word ecclesia, the assembly, okay? It's only ever used twice in the Gospels. That word gets used a ton in Acts. It gets used a ton in the epistles. And we're familiar with that as the church is being established, and then there are churches everywhere. The apostle, and that word's being thrown around all over the place, okay? In the Gospels, however, before the establishing of the church, the word church is only used twice in the Gospels. One, you may remember in Matthew 16. What did Jesus say? He said, "On this rock I will build my church," my group of people. So there is this signaling on Jesus' part that he has come to establish a group of people that will belong to him. Well, the other place that's used is a more maybe interesting or puzzling usage in chapter 18 in verse 17. Where in talking about trying to go to your brother who has wronged you and save their soul, he says if they won't listen to you or to the 2 or 3 witnesses, take it to the church. And you might ask, well, who's the church, Jesus? What are you talking about? Well, on one hand, they would have understood the concept of a synagogue, and those two words do have some overlap. So it would not have seemed probably that strange to them. They were familiar with the idea of a religious community that would hold people accountable. But it does do a little bit of that same signaling that Jesus is talking about once his people become a community, that's called the church, that he foreshadowed in chapter 16, how are those people going to live together in community? What does it look like for followers of Jesus to live together and to share their lives together? Well, you know what it looks like because you told me. All that stuff that Jesus talked about in chapter 18 is what it looks like when Jesus' followers live their lives in community with one another. Humility, putting yourself last, putting, as Mike said, salvation of others, spiritual things ahead of yourself, forgiving others, not being a stumbling block to others, as Greg pointed out, living as Albert with this grand kind of designation of we are the people of God on earth. That's a lot of authority, a lot of responsibility he's given us, okay? And carrying that out towards one another with compassion, okay? But remember that these sections of teaching also set up the next round of stories, which we move into tonight in chapter 19. So that's what I want us to think about. How do these themes from chapter 18 that y'all remembered so well, how does that continue to flow into the stories of chapter 19? And two of those stories we will focus our time on in particular. But first, let's read all of chapter 19, front to back. I think it's 30 verses. And then I'll give you your assignments, and you can be discussing the question in groups, okay? We'll get it advanced. Well, all it says is read Matthew 19, so there's nothing much to it. Let's read Matthew 19, starting in verse 1. When Jesus had finished these words, he departed from Galilee and came into the region of Judea beyond the Jordan, and large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. Some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him and asking, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all?" And he answered and said, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh? So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate." They said to him, "Why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away?" He said to them, Because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it has not been this way. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for immorality, and marries another woman commits adultery. The disciples said to him, if the relationship of the man with his wife is like this, is it better? It is better not to marry. But he said to them, not all men can accept this statement, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who were born that way from their mother's womb, and there are eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men, and there are also eunuchs who made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. He who is able to accept this, let him accept it. Then some children were brought to him so that he might lay his hands on them and pray, and the disciples rebuked them. But Jesus said, let the children alone, and do not hinder them from coming to me, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. After laying his hands on them, he departed from there. And someone came to him and said, Teacher, what good thing shall I do that I may obtain eternal life? And he said to him, why are you asking me about what is good? There is only one who is good, but if you wish to enter into life, keep the commandments. Then he said to him, which ones? And Jesus said, you shall not you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, honor your father and your mother, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. The young man said to him, all these things I have kept. What am I still lacking? Jesus said to him, if you wish to be complete, go and sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me. But when the young man heard this statement, he went away grieving, for he was one who owned much property. And Jesus said to his disciples, truly I say to you, it is hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Again I say to you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. When the disciples heard this, they were very astonished and said, then who can be saved? And looking at them, Jesus said to them, with people this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. Then Peter said to him, behold, we have left everything and followed you. What then will there be for us? And Jesus said to them, truly I say to you, that you who have followed me, in the regeneration when the Son of Man will sit on his glorious throne, you shall sit upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or children or farms for my name's sake will receive many times as much and will inherit eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last first. Okay, here's your assignment. Group one, let's see how we want to figure this out here. Do two halves of the room, basically. So I'm going to say Ian's row is still on my right side here. You guys all can be group one, and then everybody else, a little lopsided, but everybody else would be group two. So this section and that section be group two. Group one, maybe we can stretch all along the back will be group one, including this group over here, and Robert and Jeremy. Okay, so those are your groups, group one, group two, and you can talk about what's even going on in these sets of verses. Your sets of verses are given to you there. Basically, group one, you're talking about the questions about marriage. Group two, you're talking about the rich young man that comes to Jesus. But particularly discuss this. How do these themes of compassion and not being a stumbling block and being the representatives of Jesus and forgiveness and putting your own interest aside for other people, how does all of that continue to develop in your section that you're being assigned to discuss? So talk with the people around you, group up and discuss for the next 5 minutes or so or more, and then we will reconvene and share our responses in just a moment. Okay, sounds like the conversation's winding down. Let's take about 8 minutes per section here to report out, discuss these two stories. These are the two big stories of chapter 19. So if we get through these two, we'll be in good shape and ready to move on to chapter 20 on Sunday. But the discussions of marriage, group one, I guess that was back row into this right-hand section here. I guess I can advance here. how do the themes from chapter 18 that we've discussed, how do those themes find their way into the discussion of marriage that Jesus has with the Pharisees in the first 12 verses of chapter 19? Yeah, David.
So, it's a discussion of divorce, but it's really about the Pharisees trying Jesus. They wanted to catch him or try to, trip him up somehow on his own words. So they were much more concerned about their own narrow interest rather than true holiness or salvation.
Pharisees concerned for their own interest. Cool. Thank you, David. Other things y'all talked about, themes of 18 that continue into the marriage discussion. I'll share one I heard from Stephen up here in the front. Stephen mentioned forgiveness as a theme from chapter 18 and the sermon, right? And forgiveness is, as Stephen said, it's necessary, it's essential in marriage. And think about how that fits in. And again, I would say, my comment would be, that this is one of the things that we're trying to accomplish in seeing Matthew as things that are woven together as opposed to just isolated chunks that have no connection to other things around it. Jesus doesn't say anything about forgiveness in chapter 19, does he? He doesn't use that word or talk about it, okay? But think about what's going on. As David points out, the Pharisees are, testing Jesus, saying, we can get divorced, right? Well, why does the law say we can divorce? But Jesus is saying, no, God hates divorce. Divorce is not a part of his plan from the beginning, okay? You mean we got to stay together all of our lives? How in the world are you going to do that? Well, this is at least one way, one huge way that's a part of it, okay? So, again, having just read 18, it maybe enlightens us a little bit on some of the things behind, between the lines, so to speak, in chapter 19. So Stephen brought up forgiveness in relation to this discussion. Other things from group 1, other themes from 18 that are in this discussion of marriage. Yeah, Robert?
I don't know if I'm allowed to chime in as a teacher, but...
Absolutely.
Okay. But back in chapter 18, verses 6 through 9, we talked about don't let anything get between you and salvation. It's all about getting to getting to heaven. Don't let anything on this earth get in the way. And you see that same concept in chapter 19, 11, and 12, which says, hey, this might be an ideal state, but the law allows, and in this case, it's getting married. So if you can't do the ideal state, then go ahead and do what is allowed by the law so that you can still attain salvation and not sin.
Elaborate on that a little bit. What precisely do you mean about that which is allowed by the law that's not ideal?
So verse 11, all cannot accept this saying, which the saying is verse 10, if such is the case of the man with his wife, it is better not to marry. So the theory there is it's better not to be married. And then the theory goes on to explain, hey, if you're not married, then you can dedicate your life to Christ and the kingdom. But in this case, from the beginning, marriage is of God, ordained by God. So if you can't not be married and dedicate your life to Christ solely, then go ahead and be married.
Because you've posed it both ways, and I can see what you mean. On one hand, you say, well, I really want to be married, but Jesus is saying, well, there are eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom, and so don't let the fact that you're not married stand in the way. You pursue a life of devotion, while there may be some that say, well, maybe it's better to live a life of devotion, but I'm going to get married, or I am married, and Jesus would say, don't let that stop you either. This is like kind of a 1 Corinthians 7 kind of thing. Whatever circumstance you're in, devote it to God. Yeah. Thank you, Robert. Other things from group 1 about the themes of chapter 18. Well, let's at least go over the highlights of this section, and if this provokes more response, let me know. Again, as David points out, the Pharisees are not asking this question genuinely. By the way, with this subject in particular, I think we need to pay attention to that. It's common that the reason we are studying marriage, divorce, and remarriage is because of there's some situation in our life and the life of somebody else. And because those situations can be very difficult, very emotional, we need to really be on guard for going into this study of this topic with the answer we want to find and then working our way there. That's kind of, the way the Pharisees approach this. We need to be careful about that, especially with something that's as personal and as emotional as this, as opposed to just letting Jesus and the text instruct us and accepting that humbly and openly. By the way, some of that is in here in the humility of accepting the answer that Jesus gives. Jesus goes back to the beginning, another instructive thing. He goes back to Genesis 1, God made them male and female. He goes back to Genesis 2, they're to be joined and do not let man separate what God has joined together. So marriage, one man, one woman for life. The Pharisees go to Deuteronomy instead, and they say, well, Moses commanded divorce. Fake news, we might say. That's a twisting of that passage. You can jot this down, go look at it later. This is a reference to Deuteronomy 24. The language of Deuteronomy 24 is something like this. When a man finds some indecency in his wife and puts her away. By the way, what that means, finds some indecency, we've already talked about this. We talked about it in chapter 5, so I'm repeating myself a little bit, but we're not exactly sure what that means. But if he finds some indecency with her and sends her away and gives her a certificate of divorce, she marries somebody else, and that second husband sends her away with a certificate, she is not allowed to come back to the first man and marry him. Okay, that's really what the command of the law is. Don't remarry that first husband again, right? I can't really sugarcoat it and be like, oh no, isn't it so easy to understand how there was divorce under the old covenant? And it's tough. It's tough to see that in Deuteronomy 24 when you know what Jesus says was God's intent from the beginning and what his command is for his own kingdom. But I do think we should note that law in Deuteronomy 24 does offer some amount of protection for women in that society. So that as opposed to men just getting rid of their women flippantly, sorry, that's itself sounded impolite. Instead of men getting rid of their wives flippantly, okay, there's a seriousness to it because it's like, well, if she marries somebody else, you can't have her back. So, but it also keeps these women from being kind of traded around from man to man and back again because, again, there was a certain restriction on it, okay? Again, I know that doesn't make me feel totally better about Deuteronomy 24, but it does provide some context that there is some amount of protection for women. Either way, Jesus says that's not the way God wanted it. He allowed that in the law of Moses because of hardness of heart. He put up with it. But what he wanted from Genesis and what I'm saying to you now as your king, Jesus is saying, is no divorce, right? Except, he says, in a case of sexual immorality, which is just the exception. By the way, if I may also, another ironic thing about this question is that we do with the exception what the Pharisees did with their exception in Deuteronomy 24. Deuteronomy 24 was an allowance for divorce, and they turned it around and said, God commands divorce. Jesus allows for an exception in cases of sexual immorality, but oftentimes when we look at a situation and there's immorality, we say, divorce them, right? It's commanded, or something like that. And I'll just say, too, that we need to be studying chapter 19 of Matthew to understand what the restrictions are, what the law is about divorce, but let's never separate the discussion of marriage and divorce from chapter 18. And let's not forget that Jesus has just said, if your brother or sister sins against you, try to win them over, go to them, forgive 490 times. I mean, all of that has to take place in the context of a marriage as much as it has to take place in the context of a local church or whatever else. Let's not forget all of that and just rush into, well, Jesus says divorce, so let's divorce. Really what Jesus says is from the beginning it was not so. What man is joined together, God has joined together, let no man separate. And then Robert gave us some insight on this idea of some. This is hard. This is difficult. The disciples' comment reveals that it's difficult. Not all men can accept this, and so there are some that give up being married or deal with their own life circumstance to be single, and they do that for the sake of the kingdom. Okay, so let's move on here. Group 2. Sorry, Greg, go ahead. Yeah.
Just quickly, I think a complement verse to this is obviously in 1 Corinthians 7, where you can separate for a time, but it's for a purpose. It's to give yourself to prayer and fasting. So going back to, it's not a commandment to divorce if sexual immorality is present. You can use this passage in 1 Corinthians 7 to say, there's a way to work through this. There's a way to get through this, and it's to devote ourselves to prayer and fasting to understand what God would have us to do.
Thank you, Greg. Anything else on the first 12 verses of Matthew 19? Okay, group 2. The rich young man that comes to Jesus. How, remember back to our original question, how do the themes of chapter 18 find their way into the discussion that Jesus has with this young man? Yeah, Mike.
So we covered a lot of material, I think, when we were talking over this. But there were a lot of, I thought, good comments that were made. Beth was talking about particularly like what's in your heart is what's important, and she pointed out that we spent a lot of time on the selling of the possessions, but pointed out that the giving to the poor was an important part of that as well, and compassion being one of our themes from chapter 18 was important there. Joanna mentioned something about, this is not a checklist. When Jesus first starts out and answers the man and talks about, well, just follow the commandments and list those out. We talked about how as you grow as a Christian, there's expanding expectations. If you were a new Christian, something maybe more like a simple checklist is all that you are capable of comprehending and working on. But the more you grow, and this is kind of, I think, what Jesus is saying, is that he tells the rich young ruler, here's the commandments, do these. And even the ruler recognizes, I think I'm beyond that. I think, there's more that I can do. And so Jesus offers that to him. We also talked about how you've got to recognize the difference between what you need or what you think you need and what you really need. And what's truly important. And I think, we had some talk about, whether Jesus is saying that you need to give up your possessions, that's what's expected of us, which I think we recognize is not necessarily the case. But if the opportunity arose where that's necessary, where if your ability to worship God in a way that you're supposed to is founded upon the need to give up all your possessions, your career, to, for example, leave the country to go to a place where you can worship, are you willing to do that? You don't have to do that just to do it, but if the need came, would you be willing to do that? And I think that's a concern for salvation over your own interests, and those kinds of things as well. So
Cool. Thank you, Mike. Other people opportunity. I should say thank you to Beth and Joanna as well. He was citing his sources there. I appreciate that. Other things talked about in group 2, the rich young ruler and the themes of chapter 18.
It seemed as if he was looking for a checklist. So he said, what do I need to do? And then he said, you need to do these. He said, well, I've done those, so what else do I need to do? And then when that list didn't include what he wanted, then it almost seems as if he was like the Pharisees. He was asking them with the answer in mind that he was trying to get to your point earlier.
Yeah, you could say, looking for his own interest. We might say that again, repeating the theme from before. Yeah, Brian. Oh, Michael then Brian, or Brian then Michael, or maybe Michael Brian can say something over here.
This passage is pretty significant because, as Jesus says, what does a man gain if he forsakes his own soul and gains the whole world and loses his own soul? It all comes down to what is the purpose and meaning of this life. And all of us have a tendency to forget that we're going to die. We all focus upon the temporal passing things of this life because we have to, because we live in this world. Therefore, we got to deal with our jobs and providing for ourselves, insurance and retirement and house mortgages and so forth. But those things, if we're not careful, will become our highest priorities, and it'll choke out our spiritual life. And that's what we have here. That young man's wealth is now gone and rusted, and his body is bones. He couldn't bring himself to the true eternal wealth that is in his grasp, and he forsook it for that which was temporary and passing. And so what does Paul tell us? Do not, I'm forgetting my passage now. I should have it memorized. I'll paraphrase. Do not focus upon the things of this world, or the world and the things of this world. And young man couldn't do it.
Thank you, Brian. Michael?
Something else that was mentioned in our group was that if the rich young man was humble, then he would have been willing to do what Jesus asked him to do. Like if he had enough humility, he would have done what he was asked, like the disciples did. They left their family, left their jobs immediately, and they followed him. Anyhow, so that was mentioned in our group.
Yeah, great. Just in time for that's the first bell, right? I'm not too behind here. Okay, great. Thank you to all of you for your contributions to each other and in sharing out as well. And I think we got there's always more we could say about this young man that gets a lot of attention. I've heard it before. You may not agree with me, but I think it's right that this story is left open-ended to some degree. We don't know what this man ultimately decided to do. And maybe part of the reason we're not told that, by that I mean, of course, he could go away sorrowful, and then that sorrow could lead to a reflection, that could lead to a repentance, that could lead to a change, right? So we don't know. But what it does make us think about, of course, is ourselves and how we will respond, what we will make truly important, and if it will be our own interests or if it will be eternal salvation, and so on, as you guys have pointed out. I won't re-say all that. Well, let's talk about these two other paragraphs that are in Matthew 19, and again, because these things all weave together. Think about these other two short sections in Matthew 19 and how they illuminate, we could say if the Pharisees are a negative example, if the rich young ruler is a negative example, there's two positive examples sprinkled in Matthew 19 that we can end with here. One is what he says in verses 13 to 15. When the children are coming to Jesus, the disciples are saying, no, stay away. And Jesus says, no, let the children come to me, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. Robert talked about this a little bit from chapter 18, another connection to chapter 18, talking about the little ones and the children, not causing them to stumble, not despising them, back in chapter 18, verse 10. But the kingdom belongs to those who are humble. We've pointed that out, okay? Those who are trusting, okay? Contrast the children, a humble, trusting child. Contrast that with the Pharisees who think they know everything, who are looking to, find the answer they want and do the thing that they want to do, regardless of what the law says, regardless of what Jesus says, okay? Or think about the disciples that are hesitant. That sounds really hard, Jesus. I don't know if we can really do that. And on the other side, we see a child who is, humbly accepting what Jesus, tell me what to do, Jesus, and I'll do it, okay? I'm not going to depend on myself. I'm going to depend on you. Also, contrast the humble, trusting child with the self-confident, self-reliant rich man who can't give up his riches, right? The love of money is learned. There's something, one of the aspects I think of childhood innocence is that children, they're not greedy for money, okay? We teach them that somehow, or they get taught that, I should say. So there's a contrast there as well. And then the other contrast we'll make is with the end of the chapter. And this really flows out of the story of the rich young man, where Peter, after seeing this man walk away, by the way, the disciples have a similar reaction with the marriage question. They said, well, then who's ever going to get married if it's this hard, Jesus? When Jesus says that it's hard for the rich man to enter the kingdom, they say, well, then who's going to be saved? If this guy, he's wealthy, he's powerful, he keeps all the commandments, he's not going to get in, well, then who can be saved? And Jesus says, with God, all things are possible, which I think is to say that when we see God as the only source of goodness, he's the only object of worship, then whether we're rich or poor, everything we have is sacrificed on the altar of service to God, right? With God, all things are possible, right? And there's instructions in the epistles about how wealthy people are supposed to use their wealth to the glory of God and to be a blessing to other people. But Peter turns around and says, well, look, Jesus, we have left everything to follow you. I don't know if you're like me. Were you expecting Jesus to rebuke Peter here? Again, we've seen so many examples of Peter opening his big mouth, and Jesus says, no, Peter, you totally missed it. Okay, I'm expecting Jesus here to be like, stop bragging, Peter, about how much you've left. Jesus says, no. Yeah, you have left everything, and everyone who's left everything to follow me in the regeneration and the bringing in of God's kingdom, they're going to receive so much more than they ever could have imagined from giving up everything. They'll give up a family, they'll gain family. They give up status, they gain status in a much grander and much more beautiful way, many times as much, and eternal life. And the final word will lead us perfectly into our study of chapter 20 on Sunday. Many who are first will be last, and the last first. So look over chapter 20 for Sunday, and we'll run with that theme in class then. Thank you guys so much for your contributions. We'll start our devotion in just a minute or two.